So most people agree the Las Vegas Raiders had a phenomenal 2025 NFL draft from guys like Ashton Jeanty, who a lot of people felt was the best overall player in this class, to guys like Charles Grant that could easily been a first round pick had he played in the Senior Bowl, where the Raiders get him literally at the end of the third round, to some of the other guys we took later on that had tremendous upside. A lot of people love the Raiders draft, but there are some people who are questioning the Raiders' second round wide receivers. Some people are calling it, quote, puzzling that the Raiders would take this guy in the second round. So this article actually comes from ESPN, where their insiders, their draft analysts kind of got together to basically rank the worst picks and the best picks. And a part of the worst picks ended up being the Las Vegas Raiders' decision to take Jack Bech where they ultimately took him. The question was, who was the biggest head-scratching picks of the draft? And Jeremy Fowler, who I think is a very, very, very solid insider in the NFL, not necessarily when it comes to the draft, right? But he's an insider, right? And the guy definitely has a lot of people that he's connected with, a lot of scouts he's spoken to in the past. And apparently there's several scouts that told him they did not like the Bech pick. So Fowler writes, but several scouts around the league, even ones that really like Bech, felt the second round was a bit high and the third round might have been more sensible, have been a more sensible range. I want to talk about what this guy is saying here and why I totally disagree with Jeremy Fowler. You know, one of the things that I've learned covering the draft as long as I have, one of the things I've learned, while I was at the Hula Bowl as well, is that you never know which player is going to be good. And a lot of players that are good because the scheme that they kind of get into, the coach that brings them in, right? Whether it's a positions coach or maybe it's some sort of assistant. One of the things I've learned is you could never say a guy's going to be good or a guy's going to be bad without letting that guy have a year or two to develop and just kind of see what this guy can turn out to. There was a time when people wrote off Colton Miller, so this is one of the worst tackles in the NFL, only for him to develop and solidify himself as a top 15 overall NFL offensive tackle. Jack Bech, if the Raiders felt was not worth the second round pick, would not have taken him. Right, for the Raiders to take him where they took him, they obviously felt that, hey, when our next pick comes around, he might not actually be available. So if one team liked him enough, there's a chance another team could have potentially liked him enough as well. And if the Raiders decided to go down a different route with the second pick that they ultimately had, the Raiders could have potentially missed out. And in that instance, you might get stuck with like the 12th wide receiver on your board, and you might not want to do that. You'd rather take a guy 10 picks early than just miss out altogether on this guy. So I think for some scouts to say he's not worth a end of the second round, right, pick 58, he's not worth the 58th overall pick, but somehow you can take him with like pick 68, right, which is I think where the Raiders took Darren Porter. To me, that doesn't make sense, right? A difference of 10 picks makes no difference, right? And at the end of the day, only one team has to really like a player to take that player, right? Last year we saw Brock Bowers, who some people said was the best player in the class. We saw him ball and not go in essentially the first 12, 13 picks. So sometimes a player will come into a scheming system and just have more success. So for these scouts to question, right, several scouts is what Jeremy Fowler's saying. For these guys to come in here and question and say, hey, the Raiders made a mistake, I think, I think it's the wrong way to look at it, right? Because at the end of the day, these scouts, we don't know which teams they cover. We don't know if they're even still on these teams, truth be told, right? A lot of scouts get fired on May 1st, or their contracts run out May 1st. To me, I find this report not questionable, right? Obviously, maybe Jeremy Fowler's making it up, but just assuming we can believe what he's saying, we also have to factor in the Raiders didn't take Jack Bech with the 38th overall pick. Remember, we had the 30th overall pick. We could have taken Jack Bech with the 30th overall pick, but the Raiders decided to trade back twice. So the Raiders obviously felt that, hey, we think we'll still be able to get him if we trade back a couple times. And they obviously got him. And remember, going from the 38th pick to the 58th pick, sure, the Raiders may have skipped out on a wide receiver like Luther Burden, who obviously ends up getting paired with Ben Johnson of the Chicago Bears. They took him with the 39th overall pick, which would have been one pick right after the Raiders picked. Sure, you can say, hey, maybe Luther Burden would have been a better wide receiver, but we'd have to realize it's 20 picks later. And had you not made that trade, you may not have gotten Dante Thornton, who the Raiders took obviously in the 4th round. You may not have gotten Charles Grant or Caleb Rogers, right, depending on which guy the Raiders would have taken if they only had one third-round pick. To me, you can never overlook the fact that the Raiders trading back also allowed them to get a couple other guys, right? And I think for the Raiders, having that faith that Jack Bech can come into this scheme and system, he's exactly the type of player we need. We also think he can develop and learn from a guy like Jacoby Myers. I'm going to trust that John Spytek, as well as Chip Kelly, as well as Pete Carroll, know what they're doing, right? I think a lot of what I saw in this draft was they took the solid player when the player kind of became available. I might not agree with every pick, but, you know, it is what it is, right? At the end of the day, I think John Spytek did a really, really good job in this first year. And to say, you know, taking a guy in the second round, at the end of the second round is too high, I think it's kind of crazy to think. But we do have some other reports that I want to kind of get into, some bigger things that I think could impact the Raiders potentially. This is going to be a 3-piece report, so just kind of follow along here. If you guys did not see this actually happened right before the draft, where Vic Tafur actually put it out there saying that Christian Wilkins was back in a boot a month ago. Right, essentially saying that Christian Wilkins' foot was essentially rewrapped, right? He was in a boot. If you guys remember, he had the Jones fracture on the foot, which basically had him miss the rest of last season, right? I think he like week 5 or 6 kind of got hurt, and he just missed the rest of the season. He had off-season surgery, right, to fix that, and we weren't 100% sure where his recovery kind of was. He did come into the actual off-season program. And from what we had understood at that time, the boot was not on, right? There were a lot of images trending. The boot was not on, right? Everything looked good with him. But then we got this report from Vic Tafur, who said that Wilkins was in a boot. Keep in mind, this was after the offseason program had kind of started already. And we even got another report coming out by Tony Pelini. This is the second report, and there's a third one as well that I'm going to talk about here in a second. Tony Pelini doubled down, right? He's, if you guys remember, I think this was back in March. Tony Pelini actually reported that Christian Wilkins might need another procedure on the foot, right? If you guys remember, this happened, again, I think sometime in March, where Tony Pelini actually said that, hey, Christian Wilkins needs a potential surgery. It didn't heal properly or whatever it was. And then he doubled down on it, and that's what this report is, right? So for what it's worth, Tony Pelini doubled down on his report. It was sometime in March. And he said that there's still a chance that Wilkins is going to need another procedure on his foot. Now, keep in mind, Tony Pelini doubled down after the draft, right? So, obviously, the initial report that Christian Wilkins may need surgery came, a couple weeks before the draft. After the draft happened, he's saying that he still might need procedure on the foot. He said that the Raiders addressed the interior of that defensive line position. As I mentioned right before the draft, there's a problem with Christian Wilkins' foot. He may need another procedure. The Raiders added 2 potential pass rushers on the inside with Hemingway and JJ. And then he's essentially saying, he might still need that procedure. But there was an image that the Raiders posted. This was literally, I think, 2 days ago, where Christian Wilkins is hitting the bag and he does not have that boot on his foot, right? So, just kind of putting all these different reports and all these different things that are happening at different points. It's clear to me that Christian Wilkins' foot is not 100% healthy, right? So maybe he's putting that boot on to let the foot heal. He's going to take it off and do some drills, put a little bit of pressure on that foot, maybe use it right the way you would during a 17-game season. And then maybe he'll put that boot back on in a week from now. To me, I think it's kind of crazy to think that Christian Wilkins could actually miss time, because that's what Tony Pelini is legitimately saying. He's saying that there's a chance that Christian Wilkins, when the season comes around, could actually miss time. He may miss, the first half of the season. I think, we're so early on in the process. It's literally the beginning of May. We have 2 whole months, 2.5 months until training camp actually begins. I think in that 2.5 month span, the foot will continue to heal, and I think there's a real chance he won't need surgery, and I think there's a real chance he'll be good to go when training camp actually comes around. I do understand a Jones fracture is very tricky, right? It's one of those injuries where, sometimes it just doesn't heal properly. But I do think Christian Wilkins is young enough still where he will be able to heal, and hopefully he does heal. I think he'll be a big part of the Raiders as we kind of get into this season. I think, I understand the Raiders drafted 2 defensive tackles, but I think to say, hey, those 2 guys are going to come in and they'll be able to play to the, to where Christian Wilkins will essentially play, I think this is the wrong way to look at it. Those are 2 rookies that'll develop, right? Those aren't guys that are day one impact players, right? They're developmental guys. They're going to develop into it. The Raiders need Christian Wilkins. He's our second best defensive player right now. And he's, absolutely huge impact when he's out there healthy. And, again, I think we have to just relax and let this be. And I know this trended like crazy just like a week ago on Twitter. I think we're at the point where, he'll be in and out of that boot at this point forward. You'll see images of him without the boot. We'll probably see some updates with him in the boot. And I think it's just a natural, part of the healing process. He's rehabbing essentially, right? He's not going to go out there and start hitting people today. One day he might be out there running drills, hitting the bag, exploding off the foot, right? Keep in mind the get off, a big part of it is putting the pressure in that foot. I think he'll be able to kind of do those things, have a little bit of pain, let it heal, and the following, do it again. And at some point, it'll just stop hurting altogether, right? So, I did want to just bring that update to you guys, that there's at least some images of him essentially healthy, right? Essentially without the boot on. And I know, there's other reports, I think The Athletic put it out there as well, that Christian Wilkins is expected to be healthy, right? So right now, the expectations is he should be good to go when camp comes around. Anything else outside of that, I think at this point is just noise that, we don't really need going into the season. Let's wrap it up, man. There's 2 reports that are coming out. This one here is something that I'm not going to show you guys the actual video, but I'm going to just recap some of what was said. Because it does kind of tie into the last regime that the Raiders had, right? The Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler regime. Josh Jacobs talked a little bit about, how his time ended with the Raiders. And I feel for Josh Jacobs. I definitely feel for him. I think, Josh Jacobs should have been a lot more open about this at the time, because a lot of people crushed this guy on social media. A lot of Raider fans were taking huge shots at Josh. But basically in this, he basically puts it out there, right? Now, he doesn't use Dave Ziegler's name specifically, but he puts it out there and he says the people in charge. And that's how he just continues to reference it, right? And he does clarify it's not Mark Davis, has nothing to do with Mark Davis. And from our understanding, Mark Davis also does not make any decisions with the Raiders, right? He puts the general manager in position to make the decisions, and then he just sits back and relaxes. And he did that with Dave Ziegler. And one of the crazy things with Dave Ziegler is we knew right away this guy was a crappy general manager, right? Like literally right away, we knew it, right? From the first draft picks, right? We did trade for Devontae, but we had some picks in that draft, right? I think Dylan Parham was a 3rd round pick. Zamir White, I think, was a 4th round pick. Don't quote me on that. And I think that was the same year. May not have been the Matthew Butler, Neil Farrell years. That might have been the year after. It could have been those years. But then we had the following draft where we took Tyree Wilson, right? And that was questionable as hell. And just, some of the picks that the Raiders had under Dave Ziegler were questionable. And then some of how he handled things was very questionable as well. And Josh Jacobs kind of gave some insight into how he kind of handled it. And if you guys want to watch this, I'll pin it down in the comments below. You guys can watch the 7-minute segment. But basically, Josh Jacobs says, hey, I really, really wanted to be in Las Vegas. I had just spent a ton of money building a custom house, so I hadn't even lived in it. It wasn't even fully built, but I already put the money in. And, right after I had that big year, right, which is that monster, like, I forget what it was. Like, I don't think he ran for 2,000, but it was that monster year he essentially had, right? And he basically talked about how right after that year, I felt like the Raiders should have paid me essentially. And he said that they didn't want to pay me. And, they were offering me essentially $10 million, which that wasn't, I would be okay with $10 million, but I did ask, like, can you put some incentives in there, right? Maybe if I run for 1,800 yards, or if I average 6.5 yards per attempt, or have, 45 catches, whatever it might be, right? Can you put some incentives in the contract so the 10 million can be boosted? And he says they're very, very strict and they're straight to it and said, no, we're not doing that. All right. And even though he was considering the $10 million, he basically said the people in charge at that point were super disrespectful. He said there was a time when, before the season actually begun, he said, I was planning to hold out because Maxx Crosby called me. I went into the actual building. Me and Max were sitting in the parking lot and we were talking. And so shout out to Max for doing that, by the way. But Maxx Crosby and him were talking. They're sitting in Josh Jacobs' car. And he said that this person walked out to the parking lot. And he had one of the national beat reporters on the phone, right? He's saying that maybe it was Adam Schefter or maybe one of these other guys. He said that he had, and he didn't obviously name it, but he said that this guy, the guy that spoke to me basically told me, and we think is Dave Ziegler. He said basically Ziegler told me that, hey, are you ready to come back? Like, are you going to accept that contract or whatever? And Josh Jacobs basically told him, like, hey, this is what I want. And basically Dave Ziegler was just spilling everything out there, right? And he also kind of put it out there that Dave Ziegler was not only disrespectful, but every negative story he was just leaking it out there, Right? Every negative thing from Josh Jacobs' perspective, the guy that Josh Jacobs talking about just continuously leaked it out there. And he said that he does kind of regret not actually putting his own statement out there. And, I understand from Josh Jacobs' perspective why he didn't end up staying with the Raiders, even though he was willing to take, $10 million as long as they put some incentives in there for him to make up to 12 or 13 million. I do think the running back position, and I've always been open about this, I do think, you don't have to pay running backs, right? I think they're fairly easy to find if you invest in them, right? Like, for example, I think Ashton Jeanty will be a better running back than Josh Jacobs. Not saying Josh Jacobs is a bad running back, right? He's a top 10 running back right now. But if you put the investment into a running back, you will have success. So I don't think you have to pay a running back. But sometimes you should pay guys, right? And I think with Josh Jacobs, looking back at it, the Raiders should have definitely kept him around. I think a 3-year contract, $36 million, no one would have argued against that. That would have been a very, very solid contract, given that we're paying certain guys not to be here 12, 13 million, right? Guys that are not good, right? So, it's interesting however you kind of look at it, and I may not have summed up exactly what Josh said perfectly, but, it's just one of those things where I feel like the Raiders definitely handled that wrong. And it was specifically the people in charge at that point. And I'm glad the Raiders have moved off of Dave Ziegler. It's kind of crazy to me how guys like that get NFL general manager jobs. And it's not just Ziegler, right? There's plenty of guys that become general managers that are not meant to be general managers. This is not good, right? It's why we always see guys getting fired every other year, right? So hopefully John Spytek does things right. I will say this, being 100% honest, I did not like Ziegler early on. I did not like John Gruden in the Mike Mayock era early on. And I love Tom Telesco. I love what he did for the Raiders. And so far with Spytek, I loved what he did in this first season, right? So we'll see how these things kind of continue as we go forward. Let's wrap it up. We got one final report. Brock Bowers, if you guys have not heard, is not at the Las Vegas Raiders voluntary offseason program. And this is not a negative report, right? Remember the report that came out with Colton Miller came from Jeremy Fowler. That was a report that Colton Miller's agent put out there, right? Basically saying that our client's not going to be there because he wants a new contract. This is not that, right? This is basically saying that Brock Bowers is finishing up his finance degree at the University of Georgia. So he's not at the Raiders voluntary offseason program because he's finishing up his degree at the University of Georgia. That's super cool, right? I'm really, really happy for Brock Bowers that he's going back. He's getting that education. Not that I think getting a degree is all that great. To be honest, I have a degree in finance as well. Really not all that great, but I do like the fact that this guy's valuing the education elements of it, right? He might have kids down the line. Those kids might not be NFL players, and you can always go back to, hey, I graduated from college, so you should too, right? And I just wanted to kind of bring that up to you guys, right? That this guy actually graduated or will be graduating. So shout out to Brock Bowers for taking the education part of it serious. If there's one reason to miss, even though it's voluntary, if there's one reason to miss voluntary, I think this is one of them. Then maybe if you're having kids, I guess probably the other element. But, I want to know what you guys think, man. There's obviously a lot of rumors and reports from this point forward. The Raiders are in the building right now. I think they're going to break. If they didn't yesterday, I think in the next week or so, they'll take a break and they'll head out for a couple of weeks. I think at some point, I think about 3 weeks down the line, they'll get together for another couple of days. The season's not that far away, right? I know the official first game of the season's like, September, whatever it is, or end of August. But, we're going to have training camp. We're going to have guys being released, guys being signed. So, I think leading into training camp, the season basically begins right at that point because we're going to get so many news stories that kind of come out. We're going to have our team changing, right? Last year was Malcolm Koonce who tore his ACL. This year, hopefully it's not an injury. Hopefully it's something positive. Maybe the Raiders trade for Jalen Ramsey or one of these other guys, right? So we'll see what ends up happening. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thumbs up and subscribe if you're not subscribed. And I'll see you guys next time with another video.